The darkness of space surrounded the Kepler research station like a cold blanket. Inside the station, everything was quiet and peaceful. Dr. Hannah Kim sat at her workstation, checking the daily reports from the communication systems. She had been doing this job for 3 years now, and most days were the same, checking signals, monitoring space traffic, and making sure everything was running smoothly. But today was different. A soft beeping sound caught her attention. At first she thought it was just background noise from a distant star, or maybe interference from a passing cargo ship. But as she looked closer at her screens, she realized this was something else entirely. This was a distress signal, and it was very weak. Hannah's heart started beating faster. She had trained for this moment, but she had never actually received a real emergency call before. Her hands moved quickly across the keyboard as she tried to clean up the signal and make it clearer. The message was broken into pieces, like trying to hear someone talking. Through a bad phone connection during a storm, she could make out certain words that made her blood run cold. The universal emergency codes were there, the same codes that every species in the galaxy used when they were in terrible danger. But there were other words too, words that no one ever wanted to hear. "Commander Lee, you need to hear this right now," she called across the station's control room. Her voice was shaking slightly as she tried to keep calm. Commander Jun Lee was in his office, reviewing supply reports, when he heard Hannah's urgent call. He had been in charge of the station for 8 years, and he knew his crew well. Hannah was not someone who panicked easily, so when she sounded worried, it usually meant something serious was happening. Lee walked quickly to her workstation, his boots making soft clicking sounds on the metal floor. He was a tall man with gray hair, and deep lines around his eyes from years of staring at star charts and computer screens. When he saw Hannah's face, he knew this was bad news. "What do you have?" he asked, putting his hand on the back of her chair. Hannah played the cleaned-up version of the signal. Even though it was still fuzzy and hard to understand, the words that came through were horrible. They heard fragments like orbital bombardment and genocide, and any who can hear this message, please help us. Lee's face went pale. In all his years of service, he had never heard anything like this. The signal was coming from the Vega system, which was home to the Altarians. These were peaceful people who had never hurt anyone. They were known throughout the galaxy for their amazing healing abilities and their wise teachings about living in harmony. "How long ago was this message sent?" Lee asked, his voice tight with concern. Hannah checked her calculations again. "Based on how weak the signal is and the distance it traveled, I think it was sent about 6 hours ago, Commander. If I'm reading this correctly, someone is trying to kill all of them." Lee stared at the star map on the wall, showing where the Vega system was located. The Altarians had been some of the first aliens that humans had met when they started exploring space. Unlike other species who were suspicious or hostile, the Altarians had welcomed humans with open arms. They had shared their medical knowledge freely, and because of their help, millions of human lives had been saved from diseases that doctors on Earth couldn't cure. Now these same peaceful people were calling for help, and their message was so desperate that it was heartbreaking to listen to. "Are you sure about the translation?" Lee asked, hoping maybe there had been some mistake. Hannah nodded sadly. "I've run it through the computer 3 times. This message is definitely a call for help, and based on the words they're using, it sounds like someone is attacking their planet from space. They're asking anyone who can hear them to please come and help." Lee felt sick to his stomach. He had met some Altarians during a diplomatic mission 5 years ago. They were the kindest, most gentle people he had ever encountered. The idea that someone would attack them was like hearing that someone was beating up children in a playground. "Send this message to Earth's command immediately," Lee ordered. "Use priority alpha classification. Make sure they know this is extremely urgent." As Hannah began transmitting the message to Earth, both of them wondered the same thing. Would help arrive in time, or were they already too late to save their peaceful friends? The emergency meeting room deep inside Earth's military headquarters was buzzing with activity. Admiral Min Park walked into the room with quick, determined steps. She had been woken up at 3 in the morning by the urgent message from the Kepler research station. And now, 6 hours later, she was looking at information that made her feel sick and angry at the same time. The huge holographic display in the center of the room showed a three-dimensional map of nearby star systems. Red dots marked the locations where terrible things had happened recently. As Admiral Park watched, more information appeared on the screen, showing the complete picture of what they were dealing with. Intelligence Director Sun Yang stood up from his chair, holding a tablet with the latest reports. Yang had been working in intelligence for 15 years, and he had seen many bad situations before. But this was different. This was worse than anything he had encountered in his career. "Admiral, we've identified the attackers," Yang said, his voice serious and worried. "They call themselves the Dominion of Krath. For the past 6 months, they've been moving through the outer edge of our galaxy like a plague, destroying everything in their path." Yang touched his tablet, and the holographic display changed too, showed detailed information about the Krath forces. Their ships were dark and angular, designed to look frightening. Everything about them screamed violence and destruction. "In just the past month, they've completely destroyed 3 entire worlds," Yang continued. "Their method is always the same. First, they surround the planet with their warships. Then they bomb all the cities and towns from space until nothing is left alive. After that, they land and take whatever resources they want from the dead planet." General Heian Cho, who had been quietly listening, leaned forward in his chair. Cho was an older man who had fought in several conflicts during his long military career. He understood warfare better than most people, and he could see the bigger picture that was developing. "This isn't just about helping the Altarians," Cho said, his voice filled with concern. "If we don't stop these Krath right now, they're going to keep expanding their territory. They're moving in a straight line toward the more populated systems, and eventually, they'll reach human space." Admiral Park nodded as she studied the star map. She could see the pattern clearly now. The Krath were like a cancer spreading from one system to another, leaving nothing but death behind them. If they weren't stopped soon, millions more innocent people would die. "The Altarians have been our friends for over a decade," Park said, her voice growing stronger with determination. "When humans first started exploring space and encountered diseases we had never seen before, the Altarians freely shared their medical knowledge with us. They didn't ask for anything in return. They just wanted to help." She turned to face the other members of the council, her eyes blazing with resolve. "Because of their generosity, we were able to cure diseases that would have killed thousands of humans. Our children are alive today because the Altarians chose to help strangers from another world." The room fell silent as everyone thought about what she had said. Many of the people in that room had family members who had been saved by Altarian medical technology. The idea that these peaceful, helpful people were now being slaughtered was unbearable. "We don't abandon our friends," Park declared firmly. "We don't let bullies destroy innocent people while we stand by and do nothing. The Altarians answered our call for help when we needed them. Now they're calling for our help."
Oh.
General Cho stood up from his chair. "I agree completely. If we let the Krath destroy the Altarians, we're sending a message to every violent species in the galaxy that they can attack peaceful people without consequences." Intelligence Director Yang nodded. "The Krath need to learn that there are consequences for their actions. They need to understand that when they attack innocent people, they're going to face the full power of humanity." Admiral Park looked around the room at the faces of her colleagues. She could see the same determination in their eyes that she felt in her heart. All in favor of immediate military intervention to protect the Altarians? Every hand in the room went up without hesitation. The vote was unanimous. Within hours, urgent deployment orders were being transmitted to military bases across the solar system. The sleeping giant of human military power was waking up, and it was very, very angry. The bridge of the UES Retribution was a place where most people would feel completely overwhelmed. Massive screens covered the walls, showing star charts, ship diagnostics, and communication channels from across the solar system. The constant hum of engines and the soft beeping of computer systems created a background noise that never stopped. But for Captain Tay Park, this was home. Park had been commanding the Retribution for 4 years, and he knew every sound, every vibration, and every warning light on his ship. When the urgent transmission came through at 0347 hours, he was all ready. Awake in his quarters, reviewing patrol reports from the outer rim. The message was marked with the highest priority code possible, which meant only one thing: somewhere in the galaxy. Innocent people were dying, and Earth needed his fleet too. Stop it. As Park read through the intelligence briefing, his jaw tightened. The Altarians were peaceful people who had never hurt anyone. They spent their time studying medicine and philosophy, trying to make the universe a better place. The idea that someone was bombing their cities from space made Park's blood boil. With anger, all senior officers to the bridge, immediately Park announced over the ship's communication system. His voice was calm, but anyone who knew him well could hear the dangerous edge underneath his words. Within minutes, the bridge was filled with the ship's key personnel. Navigation Officer Su Jin was the first to arrive, followed quickly by weapons. Officer Kongdae and Engineering Chief Bo Ram. These were people who had served together for years, and they could work together like a well-oiled machine, even in the most dangerous situations. Orders from Earth Command, Park announced, holding up the transmission device. We're deploying to the Vega system. The Altarians are under attack, and we're going to stop it. The crew exchanged glances, but no one looked surprised. They had all heard stories about the Altarians and how they had helped humanity during the early days of space exploration. Everyone on the ship understood that this was personal. Navigation Officer Su Jin moved to her station and began pulling up star charts. Sir, I'm calculating the fastest route to the Vega system. We can be there in 18 hours if we push the engines to maximum. Do it, Park ordered. And contact the other ships in the fleet. I want everyone ready for immediate departure. What? 7th Expeditionary Fleet was known throughout human space by a nickname that made enemies tremble: the Void Reapers. It was not a name they had chosen for themselves, but rather something that had been earned through years of protecting human colonies from pirates, hostile aliens, and other threats that lurked in the darkness between stars. The fleet consisted of 47 ships of various sizes and purposes. The largest were the dreadnoughts, like the Retribution, massive vessels that could take on entire enemy fleets by themselves. Then there were the cruisers and destroyers, fast ships designed to hunt down and eliminate specific targets. The most feared were the stealth ships, vessels that could appear and disappear like ghosts, striking without warning and vanishing before the enemy could respond. But the most mysterious ship in the fleet was the U.S. Prometheus, an experimental weapon platform that carried technology so advanced that most of the crew didn't even know what it was capable of. The Prometheus was humanity's answer to the question: what happens when you give human engineers unlimited resources and tell them to build something that can end wars? Lieutenant Commander Yuhan was monitoring communications from other species. Across the galaxy, as news of the human fleet's deployment spread, reactions were pouring in from diplomatic channels, military observers, and intelligence services. Sir Han reported, "We're getting a lot of attention. Other species are monitoring our communications and tracking our movements. Some of them are calling this fleet impossibly large and lethal for what they think is just a rescue mission." Park's smile was cold and humorless. During his years of service, he had learned that most alien species didn't really understand humans. They saw humanity as just another species trying to survive in a dangerous galaxy. They didn't understand that humans were different, that they had evolved on a world that had tried to kill them every single day for millions of years. "They haven't seen us angry yet," Park said quietly. "They're about to learn why humans are called Deathworlders." As the fleet prepared for departure, word was spreading throughout human space. The Void Reapers were going to war, and everyone knew that meant someone was about to face the full fury of humanity's protective instincts. The moment before a hyperspace jump always felt like holding your breath underwater. Captain Tay Park gripped the armrests of his command chair as the UES, Retribution, and the entire 7th Fleet prepared to emerge in the Vega system. The ship's hull groaned and vibrated as the hyperspace engines pushed reality to its breaking point, bending space and time to carry them across impossible distances in mere seconds. Then, suddenly they were there. The Vega system appeared around them like a nightmare come to life. where there should have been the beautiful blue-green world of Altair Prime. Surrounded by peaceful orbital stations and civilian traffic, Park saw only destruction and horror. The tactical display on his command screen lit up with red warnings and damage assessments that made his heart sink. "Status report now," Park ordered, his voice cutting through the controlled chaos of the bridge. "Tactical." Officer Wooman's fingers flew across his control panel as he processed the incoming data. What he saw made his face go pale. "Sir, we're looking at a massacre. The Altarian orbital platforms have been reduced to floating debris. I'm detecting at least 12 major population centers on the planet that are currently on fire." The main screen showed the horrible reality of what the Krath had done. Orbital stations that had once been home to thousands of Altarians were now nothing but twisted metal and burning wreckage. Small ships were fleeing in all directions, carrying whoever had managed to escape the initial bombardment. Krath fleet composition, Min continued, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. 37 vessels arranged in bombardment formation around the planet. Their flagship, a massive battlecruiser they call the Devastator, is positioned directly over the main city. Park studied the enemy formation, and what he saw made him even more furious. The Krath ships weren't even trying to defend themselves. They were so focused on bombing the helpless planet below that they hadn't bothered to establish any kind of defensive perimeter. They were sitting there like predators over a wounded animal, completely confident that no one would dare to challenge. "They're not even defending against our arrival," Min reported, disbelief clear in his voice. "Sir, I don't think they consider us a threat. They're treating us like we're irrelevant." Park's smile was dangerous and cold. Throughout his military career, he had learned that the most dangerous moment in any battle was when your enemy underestimated you. The Krath had made the classic mistake of thinking that humans were just another weak species that would run away when faced with superior numbers. "Their mistake," Park said quietly, but his voice carried to every corner of the bridge. "Begin. Rescue operations immediately. I want every shuttle we have heading toward those refugee ships. Launch all fighter squadrons. It's time to show them what Deathworlders do when innocents are threatened." What happened next became the stuff of legends throughout the galaxy. The human response was immediate, coordinated, and absolutely terrifying to anyone watching from the sidelines. While rescue shuttles streaked away from the fleet toward the fleeing Altarian vessels, the combat ships of the 7th Fleet moved into attack formation with a precision that sent shockwaves through the monitoring stations of a dozen different species. Fighter squadrons poured out of the carrier ships like angry wasps, their pilots already locked onto enemy targets. The massive dreadnoughts moved into position with their weapons powering up, creating energy readings that made other species' sensors scream warnings. The stealth destroyers simply vanished, disappearing from all detection systems as they moved to flank the enemy formation on monitoring stations throughout the galaxy. Alien intelligence officers watched in stunned silence as the human fleet transformed from a rescue mission into a perfectly coordinated war machine in less than 2 minutes. Species that had dismissed humans as primitive Deathworlders suddenly realized they were watching something they had never seen before. It's an entire civilization that had turned warfare into an art form. Commander Veltar of the Hegemony Intelligence Service stared at his screens in disbelief. How are they moving so fast? How are they coordinating so many ships without any apparent communication lag? His aide, a young officer named Kexanon, was equally stunned. "Sir, they're not just rescuing the survivors. They're preparing to engage a force that outnumbers them." "Are they insane?" Veltar continued watching as the human fleet completed its deployment. Every ship knew exactly where to go, every pilot knew exactly what to do, and every weapon system was charging up with deadly intent. It was like watching a predator that had been sleeping suddenly wake up and realize that something had threatened. "It's family." "No," Veltar whispered. "They're not insane. They're angry. And I think the Krath are about to learn why that's the most dangerous thing in the galaxy." Admiral Vexgoth sat in his command throne aboard the Krath flagship Devastator, feeling completely confident and relaxed. For the past hour, his fleet had been systematically destroying the Altarian cities below. Everything was going exactly according to plan. The peaceful aliens had offered no resistance, their primitive defensive systems crumbling under the might of Krath weaponry. When his communications officer reported that unknown ships had appeared in the system, Vexkoth didn't even bother to look up from his tactical display. It's probably just another weak species coming to beg for mercy, or perhaps offer tribute to avoid destruction. In his 20 years of commanding Krath fleets, he had seen this scenario play out dozens of times. "Sir," his communications officer said nervously, "the unknown vessels are taking formation around our fleet. They appear to be ... human ships." Vexkoth's four eyes finally looked up at the main screen, where he could see the human fleet deploying. Around his forces, he had heard of humans before, of course. They were one of those young species that had only recently discovered space travel. Primitive Deathworlders who thought they were important just because they came from a harsh planet. The idea that they would dare to challenge the mighty Krath Dominion was almost laughable. "Humans," he said with a dismissive wave of his clawed hand. "These creatures need to learn their place in the galactic order. Open a communication channel." The channel opened, and Vexko's voice filled the void between the two fleets. His tone was filled with the arrogance and contempt that had made the Krath feared throughout this region of space. "Unknown vessels, you are interfering with Dominion. Operations, withdraw immediately or face destruction." For a moment, there was only silence. Then a human voice responded, and something about that voice made Vexkoth's confidence falter slightly. It was calm, cold, and completely without fear. This was not the voice of someone who was intimidated. "You have 30 seconds to cease hostilities and surrender." Captain Park's voice cut through the communication channel like a blade. "Or we will demonstrate why attacking defenseless civilians was the last mistake your species will ever make." Vexkoth's mandibles clicked together in what passed for Krath laughter. The sheer audacity of these primitive humans was almost entertaining. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing the most powerful fleet in this sector of space, yet they were making demands? 30 seconds? Vexkoth said, his voice dripping with amusement. "Your arrogance will be your downfall, human. You face the might of the Krath's dominion, and you dare to give us ultimatums." 29, came the cold reply from Captain Park. Something in that simple countdown made Vexkoth's amusement start to fade. There was something about the way the human said it that suggested this was not a bluff. But surely these primitive creatures wouldn't actually attack a superior force. It would be suicide. 28, Park continued, his voice never changing tone. Vexkoth looked at his tactical display, confirming what he already knew. His fleet had 37 ships, including some of the most powerful vessels in Krath space. The humans had fewer ships, and their technology was supposed to be inferior. There was no logical reason for them to attack. 27. "Sir," his tactical officer said urgently, "the human ships are powering up their weapons. Their energy readings are ... unusual. 26. For the first time since the humans had arrived, Vexkoth felt a tiny flicker of doubt. But it was too late to back down now. He had spent years building his reputation as a merciless conqueror, and he couldn't show weakness in front of his crew. 25, "Let them come," Vexkoth snarled. "When we're done with them, their wreckage will serve as a warning to any other species foolish enough to challenge the Dominion." The countdown continued, each number falling like a hammer blow. Throughout the galaxy, intelligence services and military observers watched with growing tension. Some species were already calculating the likely outcome of the battle, while others were simply amazed that anyone would dare to challenge the Krath. 3, 2, 1. Forward antimatter cannons fired, and the result was beyond anything Vexkoth had imagined possible. The first salvo struck 2 Krath cruisers, and their hulls didn't just break apart, they split open like overripe fruit, spilling atmosphere and crew into the vacuum of space, before Vexkoth could even process what had happened. The second salvo eliminated 3 escort destroyers entirely. They simply ceased to exist, reduced to expanding clouds of superheated plasma across the galaxy. Monitoring stations fell silent as species that had dismissed Humans, as primitive Deathworlders, suddenly realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. The sleeping giant of Earth had awakened, and it was very, very angry. What happened next became the stuff of legends that would be told in military academies across the galaxy for generations to come. The battle that erupted around Altair Prime was unlike anything anyone had ever witnessed before. It wasn't just a fight between two fleets, it was a demonstration of why humans had earned their reputation as the most dangerous species in known space. The Krath fleet, which had been so confident just moments before, suddenly found themselves facing an enemy that fought like nothing they had ever encountered for decades. The Krath had conquered peaceful civilizations by following the same basic strategy: overwhelming firepower, rigid formations, and brutal efficiency. It had worked against every species they had faced, from the gentle Altarians to the technologically advanced but pacifist Xenotheri. But humans were different. Humans had evolved on a world that had tried to kill them every single day for millions of years. They had learned to adapt, to think on their feet, and to turn any disadvantage into an advantage. Most importantly, they had learned to fight dirty. Captain Park's fleet immediately did something that no military strategist in the galaxy had ever seen before. Instead of engaging the Krath in open space, where the enemy's superior numbers might have been an advantage, the human ships dove straight into the debris field created by the destroyed Altarian orbital stations. What are they doing? Admiral Vexkoth demanded from his command throne. Watching in confusion as the human vessels disappeared into the wreckage, his tactical officer stared at his screens in disbelief. "Sir, they're using the debris as cover. They're maneuvering through the wreckage like it's not even there. Should have been impossible." The debris field was a chaotic maze of twisted metal, burning fuel, and spinning chunks of destroyed stations. Any sane commander would have avoided it completely. But the human ships moved through it with an agility that defied belief. There, pilots threading their massive vessels through gaps that seemed barely wide enough for a fighter craft. Suddenly, the UES Phantom and her sister stealth destroyers appeared out of nowhere, striking at the flanks of the Krath formation before vanishing back into the sensor shadows created by the debris. The attacks were surgical, precise, and devastatingly effective. Each strike took out specific targets, communication arrays, weapon systems, engine clusters, leaving the Krath ships crippled, but not destroyed. "They're not fighting like any species we've encountered," transmitted Captain Zarkith from one of the Krath cruisers, his voice filled with panic. "They're using our own tactics against us, but somehow they're doing it better than we are." The truth was even more terrifying than the Krath realized. The humans weren't just using Krath tactics, they were using everyone's tactics. Human military doctrine was built on studying every conflict, every strategy, and every mistake that had ever been made in warfare. They learned from everyone and everything, constantly adapting and improving their methods. Commander Na Young, leading the human fighter squadrons, demonstrated this perfectly. Her pilots flew in formations that shifted and changed like flocks of birds. One moment spread out in a wide net, the next moment converging on a single target like a spear thrust. They coordinated multi-vector attacks that exploited every weakness. In the Krath formations, hitting from above, below, and from the sides simultaneously. The Krath pilots, trained to fight in orderly formations and follow standard procedures, found themselves completely overwhelmed. The humans flew with a reckless precision that seemed impossible, treating their fighters as extensions of their own bodies. They performed maneuvers that should have been fatal, pulling G-forces that would have knocked out pilots from other species. How are they still conscious? One Krath pilot screamed over the communication channel as a human fighter pulled, a turn that registered over 12 Gs on his sensors. That maneuver should have killed them. What the Krath didn't understand was that humans had evolved under higher gravity than most species. Their bodies were built to withstand forces that would crush other aliens. More importantly, human pilots trained in conditions that would be considered torture by other species standards. As the battle raged on, it became clear that the Krath Dominion had made a fundamental error in their understanding of warfare. They had designed their fleet to crush peaceful civilizations that would surrender when faced with overwhelming force. They had never faced opponents who treated warfare as both science and art, who could adapt their tactics in real time, and who fought with a combination of cold calculation and burning passion for protecting the innocent. The humans were fighting not just with their weapons, but with their hearts, their minds, and their souls. They were fighting for their friends. The Altarians, who had shared their healing knowledge freely, they were fighting against bullies who picked on the defenseless. And they were fighting to send a message to the galaxy that innocent people were under the protection of Earth. The Krath were learning, too late, that there was a difference between conquering the helpless and fighting those who fight back. Admiral Vexgoth stood frozen on the command deck of his flagship, watching his carefully planned conquest turn into an absolute nightmare. 20 minutes ago, he had been confident that his fleet would crush these primitive humans like insects. Now, as he watched another of his cruisers explode in a brilliant flash of light, he was beginning to understand something that chilled him to his core. These weren't just warriors. These were something far more dangerous. The human fleet was systematically taking apart his forces with a precision that seemed almost impossible. Every shot they fired hit exactly where it was supposed to hit. Every maneuver they made was perfectly timed to exploit a weakness in his formation. It was like fighting an enemy that could read his mind and predict his every move. "Sir," his communications officer called out, his voice shaking with fear, "we're receiving surrender requests from 7 of our ships. They're requesting permission to withdraw." Vexgoth's mandibles clicked in frustration. In all his years of conquest, he had never seen his own crews panic like this. The Kraths were supposed to be the most feared warriors in this sector of space. They were supposed to be the ones who made other species tremble with fear. But as he watched the human ships moving through the battlefield like deadly dancers, he realized that his people had never faced anything like this before. The humans moved with a fluid grace that spoke of millions of years of evolution on a world that had tried to kill them every single day. They weren't just fighting with weapons and technology. They were fighting with instincts honed by eons of survival against impossible odds. "No retreat," Vexgoth snarled. "We still outnumber them. We can still win this." But even as he spoke those words, he knew they were hollow. The humans had already destroyed 12 of his ships while losing none of their own. At this rate, his entire fleet would be wiped out within the hour. Then the situation became even worse. "Sir," his tactical officer reported, his voice filled with panic, "3 of our ships are attempting to use the surviving Altarian civilians as shields. They're positioning themselves between the refugee ships and the human fleet." Vexgoth nodded grimly. It was a desperate move, but it might work. Most species would hesitate to fire if it meant risking innocent lives. Perhaps the humans would be forced to negotiate, or at least slow down their assault. But the human response was something that would haunt Vexgoth for the rest of his life, assuming he survived the next few minutes. Instead of hesitating, the human ships moved closer to the Krath vessels that were using the civilians as shields. Then, with a precision that seemed impossible, they began firing surgical strikes that somehow managed to disable the Krath ships without harming a single refugee. "How are they doing that?" Vexgoth whispered, watching in horror as his ships were systematically disabled, while the civilian vessels they were hiding behind remained completely untouched. The accuracy was inhuman. No, it was worse than that. It was impossible. The humans were somehow managing to thread their weapons fire through gaps that were only meters wide, hitting critical systems on the Krath ships while avoiding the civilian vessels entirely. "Sir," his weapons officer said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm reading impossible energy signatures from one of the human ships, the one they call the UES Prometheus. It's charging up something I've never seen before." Vexgoth turned his attention to the mysterious human vessel that had been hanging back from the main battle. Throughout the fight, the Prometheus had remained silent, not firing a single shot. He'd assumed it was some kind of support vessel, perhaps. A mobile command center. He was about to learn how wrong he had been. "Sir," reported Weapons Officer Jin Ho from the UES Prometheus, his voice cutting through the human fleet's communication channels. were ready to deploy the experimental gravitational weaponry. Captain Park's authorization came immediately. Do it. What happened next defied everything that Vexco thought he knew about physics and warfare. The Prometheus began generating localized gravity wells throughout the Krath formation, invisible forces that reached out and grabbed his ships like a giant hand. Vexcoth watched in absolute terror as his flagship's escorts began to implode one by one, their hulls collapsing under gravitational forces that shouldn't exist. The metal screamed as it was crushed, and the ships crumpled like paper in a fist, their crews dying instantly as the artificial gravity wells compressed them into nothing. "This is impossible," he whispered, his 4 eyes wide with horror. Not just using weapons, they're using the fundamental forces of the universe itself. The truth hit him like a physical blow. These Deathworlders hadn't just mastered warfare, they had weaponized gravity itself. They had taken one of the basic forces that held the universe together and turned it into a weapon of unimaginable destruction. As he watched his fleet being systematically crushed by forces that his science could barely comprehend, Admiral Vexcoth finally understood what he was facing. These weren't just another species with advanced technology. These were beings who had turned survival into an art form, who had spent millions of years learning to fight against a universe that wanted them. Dead, and now they were very, very angry. The battle was turning into a complete disaster for the Krath forces. What had started as a routine bombing mission against defenseless civilians had become a nightmare that Admiral Vexcoth could never have imagined. More than half of his fleet had been destroyed or disabled, and the remaining ships were desperately trying to escape the human vessels that pursued them like hunting wolves. "All ships retreat to hyperspace coordinates," Vexcoth ordered, his voice no longer carrying the arrogant confidence it had possessed just an hour earlier. "We're pulling back to regroup." But the humans had other plans. As the surviving Krath vessels attempted to flee toward the edge of the system where they could safely jump to hyperspace, the human fleet pursued them with a relentless determination that terrified the alien crews. The humans weren't just fighting to win, they were fighting to send a message. "Captain!" Park's voice suddenly cut through all communication channels, broadcasting on every frequency across the galaxy. His words were calm, measured, and absolutely terrifying in their cold certainty. "Let this be a lesson to any who would commit genocide in our presence," Park announced, his voice carrying to monitoring stations and intelligence services throughout known space. "We are humanity, children of Earth, and we do not forgive. We do not forget. We do not show mercy to those who show none." The message was being received by dozens of species across the galaxy. In the council chambers of the Galactic Trade Federation, alien diplomats listened in stunned silence. In the war rooms of various military powers, generals and admirals took notes about what they were witnessing. Everyone understood that they were watching history being made. The human fleet continued its pursuit, methodically hunting down every fleeing Krath vessel. There would be no escape, no chance for the aggressors to regroup and attack another defenseless world. The humans had decided that the Krath Dominion's reign of terror was ending here and now. Admiral Vexcoth found himself in an impossible situation. His flagship, the Devastator, was surrounded by human vessels that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The massive dreadnought U.S. Retribution positioned itself directly in front of his ship, its weapons trained on his bridge, took positions around his flanks, cutting off any possibility of escape. For a moment, it was silence across the battlefield. Then Captain Park's voice came through the communication system one final time, speaking directly to Admiral Vexcoth. "Surrender now and face justice. Continue fighting and face extinction." The offer was simple and clear. Vexcoth could surrender, his ship and crew, and they would be taken as prisoners to face trial for their crimes. Or he could continue fighting and face the complete destruction of his remaining forces. It should have been an easy choice, but Admiral Vexcoth was a product of Krath military culture where surrender was considered the ultimate disgrace. He had spent his entire adult life building a reputation as a merciless conqueror, and the idea of being taken prisoner by what he still considered to be primitive Deathworlders was unbearable. Instead of responding to the surrender offer, Vexcoth made the last and most terrible decision of his life. He ordered his remaining weapons to target the human rescue shuttles that were still evacuating Altarian civilians from the planet below. "If we're going to die," he snarled to his crew, "we'll take as many of them with us as possible." The Devastators. Weapons fired at the defenseless rescue shuttles, carrying wounded Altarians who had survived the initial bombardment. It was an act of pure spite. A final attempt to cause pain and suffering even in defeat. The human response was immediate and final. Every human ship in the area focused their weapons on the Devastator simultaneously. The combined antimatter fire from dozens of vessels struck the Krath flagship with the force of a small star. The massive ship didn't explode or break apart, it simply ceased to exist, reduced to its component atoms by concentrated energy that tore apart the very bonds holding matter together. Admiral Vexkoth and his crew didn't even have time to scream. One moment they were there, and the next moment there was nothing but empty space where their ship had been. The few remaining Krath vessels that witnessed the destruction of their flagship immediately powered down their weapons and broadcast surrender signals. The fight had gone out of them completely. They had seen what happened to those who threatened innocent people in the presence of humans. They wanted no part of it. Across the galaxy, the message was received loud and clear. The Krath Dominion's expansion had ended, not with conquest, but with the complete annihilation of their fleet by an enemy they had dismissed as primitive. The Deathworlders of Earth had drawn a line in the stars. Anyone who crossed it would face consequences beyond imagination. The age of bullies picking on the defenseless was over. Humanity had made sure of that. 3 weeks after the battle, the Vega system looked very different from the war zone it had been when the human fleet first arrived. Where there had once been burning orbital platforms and fleeing refugee ships, now there were construction vessels and repair stations working around the clock to rebuild what the Krath had destroyed. The human fleet had not left after their victory. Instead, they had stayed to help with the massive reconstruction effort that would be needed to restore Altarian civilization. Engineering ships from Earth had arrived carrying prefabricated habitats, medical supplies, and everything needed. To get the survivors back on their feet, Captain Park stood on the observation deck of the UES Retribution. Watching as human and Altarian crews worked side by side to rebuild one of the orbital research stations was a scene that filled him with quiet satisfaction. This was what the human fleet was really meant to do, not just to fight wars, but to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The Altarians had been understandably terrified of their human saviors at first. After watching the methodical destruction of the Krath fleet, many of them had wondered if they had simply traded one group of violent conquerors for another. The humans had fought with such brutal efficiency that it was hard to believe they could also be peaceful. But as the weeks passed, the Altarians began to see a different side of humanity. The same people who had reduced enemy ships to atoms were now working 16-hour days to restore their world. Human medics were treating wounded Altarians with the same dedication they had shown in battle. Human engineers were designing new cities that would be even better than the ones that had been destroyed. Elder Zothan, the surviving leader of the Altarian Council, had spent those 3 weeks watching the humans work. As the eldest member of his species, he had lived through first contact with dozens of different alien civilizations. He'd seen peaceful traders, aggressive conquerors, and everything in between. But he had never seen anything like the humans. Today he had finally worked up the courage to approach Captain Park directly. The human captain was supervising the construction of a new planetary defense system, not to protect Earth's interests, but to make sure the Altarians would never again be defenseless against future attacks. Captain Park Zethan said, his voice carrying the formal tones of Altarian diplomatic speech. "I wanted to speak with you about your people." Park turned to face the elderly Altarian, whose blue-tinted skin and large eyes made him look fragile compared to the battle-hardened human captain. "Of course, Elder. How can I help you?" Ten was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Your species frightens us," he admitted finally. "The way you fought, the way you destroyed the Krath fleet, was terrifying to witness. We have never seen such capacity for violence." Park nodded solemnly. He had expected this conversation eventually. "Understand your fear." We are a violent species, Elder. Our world made us that way. But that's what I don't understand, Zothon continued. You have this incredible capacity for destruction, yet you use it to protect others. You answered our call when no one else would. You could have ignored our distress signal, or arrived too late, or demanded payment for your help. Instead, you came immediately, fought a superior enemy force, and then stayed to help us rebuild. Park looked out at the construction work happening. Around them, we protect those who cannot protect themselves. That's what makes us human. Our world was harsh, Elder. It tried to kill us every day for millions of years. We learned to fight, but we also learned that survival depends on protecting the group. We learned that the strong have a responsibility to shield the weak. Word of what had happened in the Vega system was spreading throughout the galaxy faster than the speed of light. Every species with communication technology had heard about the human fleet's intervention. The story was being told in 1,000 different ways, but the message was always the same. The Deathworlders of Earth had drawn a line in the stars. Crossing it meant facing consequences that no aggressive species wanted to contemplate. In the council chambers of the hegemony, military leaders were quietly shelving plans for expansion into systems with human allies. In the war rooms of the Confederation, generals were calculating whether their fleets could stand against human intervention. In the trading posts of the Outer Rim, merchants were spreading stories about the day the humans had made the galaxy a safer place. But the most important change was happening in the smaller, peaceful civilizations that had always lived in fear of their more aggressive neighbors. Species like the Altarians were beginning to understand that they were no longer alone. There was now a power in the galaxy that would come to their aid, not for profit or conquest, but simply because it was the right thing to do. The SOS had been answered, and the galaxy would never be the same.